agenda. So here's my agenda. What is emergence? What is it? And then after I go through the explanation of what it is, I'm going to give some examples of emergence at various scales. And you'll see why that's pertinent when we get there. And then finally, I'm going to talk about a model of reality that's built on this idea of emergence. And I find this particularly interesting. And I had a physicist at one of my talks, and he didn't argue with me about this model of reality, but he didn't completely buy into it either. So it's still up for debate. But anyway, let's talk about emergence. What is it? Emergence was first really discussed as an idea based on the work of two scientists. One was Evelyn Fox Keller. She has a PhD in physics, and she wrote her dissertation on molecular biology. Why a physicist talking about molecular biology? I'm not sure. But anyway, she met a visiting scholar at Harvard named Lee Siegel in 1968, and he was a mathematician. And they discussed her ideas, and he took a mathematical perspective of it, and they drilled down on this idea of hers based on slime mold. So what is it about slime mold? Well, this particular slime mold that she was an expert on, Dictyostelium discoideum, it's one of the best known of a group of slime molds. It spends most of its life, or at least part of its life, as a single-celled amoeba. And this amoeba, it's just a blob of protoplasm, and it feeds on bacteria that grows in decomposing leaves on forest floors. And when it's an individual, that's it. It's an individual amoeba, and it lives its life, and it eats bacteria. But when food is short, hundreds of thousands of these amoebas come together, and they fuse into a single entity. When they combine, the new entity is a completely different organism, has totally different characteristics. And even if you knew everything there was to know about this amoeba, you would not be able to predict what that new collective organism would be, or what it would be like, or how it would behave, or anything. One of the things that biologists wonder when they look at the lifestyle of this amoeba, and that picture there, that's the combined organism, that's the slime mold. They wondered what mechanism tells all these individual amoebas to come together and meet up. And in 1968, back then, their biggest question was, well, which one is in charge? Who's the guy, the pacemaker, that sends out the chemical signal that says, okay, let's all get together? When they got into it, though, and they started doing their research, what they found was when an amoeba is not getting enough food, it produces a chemical that it leaves on the ground called AMP. And if an individual amoeba detects more of this AMP than they put out, they move toward the source of the greater amount. And over time, what happens is they start to come together into a group, and that's when they combine. So this process, although it's chemically driven, and it's just based on a simple rule, if there's more AMP out there than I'm making, well, I'm going to head towards it. That gives the appearance of somebody being in charge. But there is nobody in charge. There is no pacemaker. But to biologists in 1968, this didn't make any sense, because at that time, biologists thought the world was organized top down. So for them, there had to be somebody in charge. Well, who was in charge? Where's the guy in charge? Where's the founder cell? Where's the pacemaker? And they were very unsatisfied with what they were seeing. And this pacemaker hypothesis went on for quite a long time, at least another 10 years, until finally they did enough experiments that they were finally convinced that the slime mold cells were organizing not from top down, but from bottom up. But it took a whole 30 years, now we're talking like 1998, before the mechanism was finally accepted by biologists. So this is when emergence actually got some traction. But up to this point, it was assumed that the universe was a top-down structure. Now, why is that? Well, one reason is because of religion. Religion is a top-down structure. If you're talking about religion and you ask questions like, well, gee, why does it rain? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why does the sun shine? Why do birds sing? Why are flowers pretty? Why do children get cancer? Well, it's because God is directing all of this stuff. It's a top-down structure. Another example of this is teleology. And teleology is the way a child thinks. If you say to a child, why does it rain? The child is going to say, well, it rains so that the grass can grow. It rains so that flowers can grow. Why does the sun shine? It shines so that we can be warm when we go outside. Why do birds sing? Because bird song is enjoyable to listen to, and I love to listen to bird song, and that's why they sing, and so on. And basically what they're saying is, it's all effect driven. It rains because rain is good for grass. It's the effect that's driving the rain to fall. And that's a top-down way of thinking. And that's normal. This is the way children think normally. They're not taught to think this way. It's the way they think. So it's the way scientists think too, if they're never taught to think a different way. But it turns out that once they understood this idea of emergence, they realized that in nature, change almost never happens as a result of top-down processes or preconceived strategic plans or from the mandate of any single individual or boss. Almost never. In nature, nearly everything is bottom-up. Well, this was a big change in the way people thought. So there are probably rules around this, right? Well, what are the rules for the slime molds? Well, it turns out that at the lowest level, every node, which in this case is an amoeba, is interchangeable at the start. Every amoeba is just like every other amoeba. They're plug compatible, as we used to say back in the computer industry. Right from the start, right from the get-go. So if an amoeba dies, all the other amoeba, they don't really care because they'll just replace the dead amoeba with a live amoeba and everything continues to work just fine. Because every one of them is identical. There's no difference. But the emergent entity, the slime mold that arises out of these more fundamental entities is novel. It's irreducible with respect to the individual amoebas. The movement is from low-level rules, like that rule about AMP, to higher-level sophistication, or the appearance of higher-level sophistication. So here's a little video about slime molds. Bandwidth could be better.
Meet the slime mold Physarum polycephalum. It looks kind of like a fungus, but it's actually a single-celled life form known as a protist. The thing about Physarum is that it doesn't have a brain or even a nervous system, but nevertheless, it can make surprisingly sophisticated decisions. For example, slime molds can find the shortest route through a maze toward a piece of food. First, the slime mold extends its tendrils through every corridor, essentially mapping the entire maze. It then retracts every tendril that didn't find food, leaving behind a trail of slime that acts as a kind of external memory. The trail reminds the slime mold that certain corridors are dead ends. It avoids these areas and grows exclusively along the shortest path from the beginning of the maze to the tasty treat. But that's not all. After scientists placed food in the relative position of major cities and urban areas, slime molds accurately recreated the rail system of Tokyo and the major roadways of England, Canada, Spain, and Portugal. In other words, this one cell solved a real-world problem that it took teams of engineers to figure out. This might not sound like rocket science, But these experiments are just beginning. Researchers are discovering more examples of Physarum slimy smarts all the time. And this single-celled organism is proving that complex decision-making doesn't require a big brain. In fact, it doesn't require a brain at all.
Okay, so now a lot of things that are said in that little video cause me problems. First she tells you that it doesn't have a brain, but then she talks about decisions. There are no decisions there. Basically what the slime mold is, or what it's doing, is it's a little computer running an algorithm. And so it's a very simple computer, and the algorithm is very simple. You produce AMP in response to food availability. If the AMP reaches a particular threshold, then you move toward the source of the AMP. You drop trails in response to hunger, and you delete trails in response to failure to satisfy the hunger, and then you grow along the successful trails. That's it. Those are the rules regarding the interaction and position of slime molds in this network of amoebas. So there's a kind of decentralized communication mechanism, and that's these chemical signals. That's how they communicate, although communication is a strong word for what they're doing. Another question that comes up then is, well, how many amoeba are required to instantiate a slime mold? One isn't enough, clearly. Or two? Probably not. 50? What's the number? There's some threshold level where if you don't have that threshold, you're not actually creating a slime mold. Now, emergence, the term emergence, means bring to light or unforeseen occurrence. And complexity theory, and this is where the mathematician comes in at the beginning of this talk, complexity theory provides a computational model for emergence, and that's why the mathematician was so interested in what these slime molds were doing, because he developed a model of how it works. Now, pattern formation in emergence can yield two different kinds of emergence, strong emergence and weak emergence. Weak emergence can be understood through an understanding of the fundamental parts. Like a brick wall, if you know what a brick is, you can visualize a brick, you can play with them, you can stack them up, you can envision, wow, I could make a wall out of this, right? And when you look at a wall, you can say, oh, I understand this. It's made from individual bricks. So it's a very weak kind of emergence because you can actually predict a wall based on the knowledge of a brick. And you can understand how a wall works based on understanding how a brick works. But strong emergence is not understandable through an understanding of the fundamental parts. If you look at a generator, for example, you can see each individual part and say, okay, a pulley, I know what a pulley does. And well, there's a rotor in there. I can see that spins, and it spins inside this other thing. And you might even, if you're really clever, be able to put this whole thing together. And you might attach something to the pulley and make the whole thing spin. But you can't predict that it's going to generate electricity. Nothing in this says it's a generator of electricity. You have to understand the generation of electricity at that high level first. And, okay, that's an emergent property of this generator. It creates something new, electricity. Emergent entities, properties or substances, arise out of more fundamental entities and yet are novel or irreducible with respect to them in strong emergence. So if you take something like physics, if you know all there is to know about physics, and you know about electrons, you know about protons and neutrons, and you know about electron valences and chemical or the bonding of neutrons to protons and all of that, that still doesn't enable you to predict chemistry. Chemistry is an emergent product of physics. The movement is from the low-level rules of physics to a higher level sophistication of chemistry. And if you know all about chemistry, that doesn't enable you to predict that a string of chemicals could reproduce itself and evolve into an organism and become a whole new science of biology. Chemistry doesn't tell you this. Biology is an emergent property of chemistry. So there are properties in biology, even laws, at these hierarchical levels of nature that are not derivable from or reducible to the properties and laws of the lower levels, and they're not predictable. And even if you know all about biology, and you even know all about evolution, that doesn't enable you to predict that some living creatures will develop brains, right? Because you'd have to know what a brain is first before you can predict that a brain can come into existence. Emergence is the phenomenon wherein complex, interesting, high-level function is produced as a result of combining simple, low-level mechanisms in simple ways and the rules that are associated with them. And then finally, if you know all about the brain, that doesn't enable you to predict that a mind could emerge from a brain. Just got to pop up, sorry. So what are some examples of emergence? Well, I'm going to talk through these. Let's start with evolution. Because if you think about it, evolution itself is an emergence engine. So let's take a look at it. And one of the big questions in biology and biological science is, how did it all start, right? Where did the first string of RNA come from? And for a long, long time, nobody knew the answer. But in 2022, just last year, it was discovered that the only requirement for the production of RNA is water running through volcanic glass. So what does that tell you? That says any rocky planet with liquid water is going to produce strings of RNA just because the water flows through the volcanic glass. And this has been reproduced in a lab many times. So water going through volcanic glass gives you RNA. Now, the interesting thing is this process can go on for 1 million years. So you're going to get some variation in these strings of RNA. You'll produce RNA version 1 and RNA version 2 and RNA version 3. And these things replicate themselves. And once in a while, they replicate themselves and make a little mistake. And eventually you get one that kicks out a very complex form of RNA that looks a lot like the building blocks of DNA. And eventually, you know, we got evolution going on. Because the way it works is you've got replication with occasional errors. So at first the RNA, you know, replicates itself and produces identical copies of itself, and they reproduce and present identical copies of themselves. But eventually you get one that's a little funny. And that one that's a little funny might have the ability to outproduce or more efficiently use raw materials or be more complex in a beneficial way than the other RNA. In other words, it increases the viability of current and future generations of itself. So then it replaces all of the older generation. It uses up the resources and doesn't allow the older generations of RNA to have them. So they disappear. So we got a few simple rules then in evolution. Replicate with occasional errors, compete, and anything that increases the viability of current and future generations gets to stick around, where changes that do not increase the viability of current and future generations falls to the wayside and dies out. And what results in the end is the appearance of intelligent design. So if you're a top-down thinker, if you're a religious thinker, if you're a teleological thinker, you look at this and you say, this is designed, but it's really not. It's an emergent property of the mechanism of evolution. It's the rules. So now we're going to talk about ant colonies, because ant colonies are a result of evolution, but at a more complex level. The micro-behavior of individual ants creates the overall behavior of the colony. An ant colony is a self-organizing system based on the micro-behavior of the individual ants. It used to be thought, and again, this is going back to, pre-1970, people thought that the queen ant was in charge. But later on, they found out that the queen ant doesn't do anything other than lay eggs. She doesn't rule, she doesn't direct, she doesn't plan. All she does, she lays eggs. The colonies are not command economies. They're driven strictly by the behavior of the individual ants. This is a picture of something called a midden. And this is from a colony of harvester ants. And what it is the colony garbage dump. When they've got garbage in and around their nest, ants pick it up, carry it out, and they drop it in the midden. And if ants die inside the colony, they pick up the dead ants and they carry them out to a cemetery. And oddly enough, the midden and the cemetery are the same distance from the colony, but in opposite directions. So there's some micro behavior of individual ants that says, oh, this is garbage. I go in this direction, I go this far, and I drop the garbage. But if it's a dead ant, I go in a different direction, just as far, and I drop the dead ant. In 1956, a very famous entomologist who recently died, Edward O. Wilson, proved that ants communicate with one another. And he did it with an interesting experiment. He actually dissected ants under a microscope, and he found that they have a little organ at the very tail end of the ant that deposits a chemical. And he extracted that chemical, and using ants, he showed that they would follow the chemicals that came out of that little organ. And what he determined was that the ants recognized the pheromone trails that are left by other ants, and based on the pheromone and how strong it is, the ants will behave in a particular way. Now, for an ant to do that, it has to have some brain cells because it's more complex than an amoeba, and it has to recognize different kinds of pheromones and behave differently based on those pheromones. Now, an ant brain is pretty small. It only has 250,000 brain cells. And a human brain, at least in the cerebrum, has 86 billion. So an ant brain is 3,400,000 the size of a human brain. So it can't do the complex behaviors of a human brain, so it's limited in what it can do. But they're very successful, even with their very tiny brains. Ants and termites rival humans in biomass. If you weighed all the ants and termites in the world, they'd weigh more than we do. And environmental impact. Ants live everywhere except Antarctica, Iceland, Greenland, and Polynesia, probably because they just couldn't get there. And a harvester ant colony in the field will not only ascertain the shortest route to a food source, it will also prioritize food sources based on their distance, ease of access, and other signals that they get back. In response to changing external conditions, worker ants switch from nest building to foraging to raising ant pupae. So how do they do all this? Well, now we get back to emergent behavior. Every ant is identical, right? So again, with emergent behavior, you have a node, in this case, an ant, and they're all plug replaceable. So every egg that's laid could become a queen, a drone, or a worker. But if it becomes a queen, the queen is just like every other queen. They're plug replaceable. Every drone is just like every other drone. They're plug replaceable. And every worker is identical to every other worker. If a worker ant dies, the other ants don't care. They'll just replace that dead worker with a live worker, and it'll pick up the same job. And ignorance is useful in this case, because the colony is made up of many, many parts. but the parts are very simple. They only have these little tiny brains that are pre-programmed. When the thing becomes a worker ant, it's pre-programmed to have worker ant behaviors. And all the parts are plug and replaceable. So what happens? Well, if the colony requires a queen, the colony is going to convert, the ants that work with the eggs are going to convert some of those eggs, or one of those eggs, into a queen egg. And you've heard of, in bees, they have a kind of food that they feed the queen bee egg called royal jelly. Same thing happens with ants. And what drives all of this behavior is a piece of code built into the DNA of the ants. And that code is called epigenetics. If the colony has a virgin queen, the epigenetics of the virgin queen says, the epigenetics of the ants that take care of the eggs say, well, we have to convert some of the eggs to drones because we got a virgin queen. She has to get impregnated, right? So their DNA says, okay, behave in this particular way, convert some eggs to drones, and if you're a virgin queen, your epigenetics tell you have to swarm with the drones, so you do that. It's a programmed behavior. And if you're a drone, you swarm with the queen, you mate with the queen, you're done, you die. And if you're a fertilized queen, you start laying eggs. That's it, you run the program. If you're not a queen or a drone, you're a worker and you'll operate on the rules of the worker. You run that program. And we know these rules are encoded in the DNA of the ants, they have to be. And the mechanism that runs in there, the code itself, based on external triggers, responding to external triggers, is epigenetics. So it's a machine. Harvester ant colonies constantly adjust the number of ants actively foraging for food based on variables. And these are variables that are measurable external variables. So the colony size somehow gets measured by the ants, and it affects their behavior. And the amount of food stored in the nest is going to somehow affect the behavior of the ants through external mechanisms. The amount of food available in the surrounding areas is going to have an impact, the presence of other colonies in the near vicinity. So how is all of this stuff communicated then? Well, the perceptual world of an ant is limited to the street level, and they're blind, by the way. So they don't see the street they live on. So somehow they're picking up all the information they know about the world and all the things that affect the behavior is happening at that level. And the great bulk of perceptual information is based on just 20 items, pheromones and some ant-to-ant touching. And there's only 10 to 20 things that are involved here, pheromones and touching. So from this, they get things like when they touch each other, they tell each other what they're doing. So one ant will touch another, and he says, I'm foraging for food. And the ant that's being touched will record that, foraging for food, 1, and he counts it. And if he meets another one who tells him I'm foraging for food, he says, 2, and records it. Then there's trail attraction. When the ant is moving along, if he comes across a pheromone trail, that pheromone trail will say there's food near here, and based on the strength of the pheromone, the ant can tell which direction that food is. And there's also alarm behavior. This is also based on touching and pheromone release. And the signals like run away, defend the area, attack left, stuff like that. And then there's the necrophoric behavior of let's get rid of these dead comrades and carry them in this direction and then drop them. And a lot of this is based on patterns. When an ant goes out foraging, it doesn't go in a straight line. It follows a particular pattern. It'll go out a distance, it'll turn left, it'll turn left again, it'll turn left again, go a certain distance, and then turn left again, and repeat this pattern over and over and over again until it hits on something. And what it hits on is either a food source, or a danger source, or a pheromone trail. And if it finds a pheromone trail, it follows it. If it finds a food source, it drops the pheromone trail and heads back to the nest. And then if another ant also following its search pattern, finds its pheromone trail, finds the food source, it'll go back to the nest and also add to that pheromone trail and strengthen it. These ants that meet each other and tell each other what they're doing are counting each other. How many of us are doing this job, job A, as opposed to job B? And they're building up ratios in their brains of workers on a mission. And they have these ratios of different missions. And if there's a shortage of ants doing a given role, then one ant will drop the role it's doing and it'll take on a new role. And this is all based on the number of ants encountered, their roles in a given period of time. It's based on the types and amounts of pheromones they encounter on a given period. If there are enough pheromones saying there's food out there, an ant may stop doing what it's doing, carrying dead ants out, and say, oh, I better go out and get some food. Target resources that are encountered is what triggers it to drop its pheromones. Dangers encountered, random encounters with other ants or ants from another colony are going to cause behaviors. So we have all this raw data. There's needs of the nest, there's resources available, there's assets in the form of other ants, there's discoveries that are made by accident, and there's conditions in the field and in the nest. So each ant has to pay attention to its neighbors, the markers, the environment. They collect the data and they perform statistical analysis. So this little tiny 250,000 neuron brain, it does its statistical analysis, and the answer that it kicks out of its analysis triggers behavior to move toward the desired state, whatever that desired state might be. And in this case, because of the way this works, more is different. The statistical analysis of 10 ants is insufficient to be accurate because the ratios they encounter are not going to be very big. The number of pheromones they encounter are going to be very small and so on. So they're not going to be able to predict how they should behave. 10 ants is not enough. One ant will overestimate or underestimate. 2,000 ants, they might average out to an answer that's actually pretty good. And then the micromotives lead to the macro behavior. So there's some critical mass. What's the number? Is 10 ants enough? Is 100 ants enough? Is 1,000 ants enough? It takes some number of ants to make a colony. Now let's think about more complex organisms like mammals. Every cell in a mammal is interchangeable at the start. So let's take a look at cellular behavior. When a mammal starts out, it starts out with a fertilized egg, and it's a single cell. And inside that single cell, once it's fertilized, it's got a set of DNA. And that DNA, remember, has in it all the information it needs to produce more cells, and then using epigenetic programming, differentiate the cells. So the egg divides, and it divides, and it divides again. And this picture, I forget the Latin name, but it means mulberry, because you can see that the cell looks about like a mulberry. And it's at this point, when it looks like a mulberry, that the cells start to differentiate into different kinds of cells. So how does a cell know what its role is? Right? We know epigenetics is going to drive it, but the epigenetics has to be triggered too. It turns out that cells regulate their division by communicating with each other. So there's a network again. And again, we're looking at emergent behavior, right? You've got the single nodes that are identical, the single cells, and you've got a network for communication, and it's based on chemical signals from special proteins called cyclins. And these cyclins, along with salts and sugars and amino acids and proteins and nucleic acids, are passed from cell to cell through tight junctions, adherens junctions, desmosomes, gap junctions, and then there's a substrate called hemidesmosomes. And the cells communicate, and one cell will tell another cell, I'm a brain cell, or I'm a lung cell, or I'm a liver cell. And this leads to gene expression, because the epigenetics of the cell, when it gets all these chemical signals, triggers the expression of the appropriate gene to produce the proteins that turn that cell into the appropriate cell. And levels of these cyclins act as a feedback mechanism. And the epigenetics then says, okay, trigger this DNA sequence. Matt Ridley wrote, "The great beauty of embryo development, the bit that human beings find so hard to grasp, is that it is totally decentralized. Since every cell in the body carries a complete copy of the genome, no cell needs to wait for instructions from authority. There is no authority. Every cell can act on its own information and the signals it receives from its neighbors." So, so now we've seen that with slime molds, we've seen with ants, we've seen with cells in complex organisms, that there are networks. So there have to be some rules for these networks. Every low-level node is interchangeable at the start. There are rules regarding interaction and position in the network. And there's a decentralized communication mechanism that makes these low-level nodes change their behavior in some way. And there's always a functional threshold. One cell is not a complex organism, nor is 1,000. You know, it takes millions, trillions of cells to make a human. But you get these amazing complex behaviors from these individual nodes. This is a picture of something called a murmuration of larks. And you've either seen this in real life or you've seen it in a video. And this is where a bunch of larks are flying, and they all have rules about how far they should be or how close they should be to any larks around them. And they maintain those positions based on that rule. And as a result, you see them flying around, and it looks as though it's a single organism, and it has some direction and has some motivation, but it's not. It's just a bunch of birds following a rule. Now, a brain is a pretty complicated thing. Is a brain also something that's emergent from nodes following rules using networks and communication? So let's take a look. In any functional area of the brain, it turns out, the majority of neurons are essentially identical. There are different types of neurons, and they have different kinds of behaviors and different kinds of connectivity depending on what kind of neuron they are, but they also tend to be in different parts of the brain. So a sensory neuron isn't in the part of the brain that thinks about the future, for example, because that's got nothing to do with sensing things. And a motor neuron is not in a part of the brain that figures out what you're listening to with your ears, and so on. These different kinds of neurons have different functions, but they are all collected in areas where they have common behavior and common rules. Every neuron, though, is connected from 1 to 10,000 other neurons, and these neurons communicate with neurotransmitters. And they form, based on this connectivity and their communication, they form neural networks with feedback loops based on a process called backpropagation. And what that allows them to do is learn to recognize things and be rewarded when they recognize the things they should, and be suppressed when they are mistaken in what they're recognizing. So these neural networks, it takes about 100 neurons in a neural network to recognize something. And all these neural networks are primarily pattern matching engines. Now, the brain has about 86 billion neurons operating in parallel. And if you divide that by 100, you can figure out how many pattern matching engines are running in the brain. But of course, not all of these are pattern matching engines. Some of them do other things that are more or less complex. But neurons in themselves are not brains. Brains are a collection of neurons and neural networks. So again, looks like they might be emergent. Brains might be emergent out of neurons and neuron behavior. So here's a picture of a neuron, and you see it's got a central body, and it's got inputs and they're labeled excitation here. And let's assume this is a neuron that's used for hearing. It's in the parietal lobe of your brain, which is over on the side of your brain. And signals are coming from the cilia in your inner ear. And when a certain frequency is activated, like you hit a piano key and you hit the A key, and A is 440 vibrations a second. And when you hear that note, a certain cilia vibrates and it sends out little pulses. So those red spikes you see coming in, called excitation, are coming from the piano key that plays the note A, resonating against that one little cilia inside your cochlea in your ear, and it excites that input into the neuron. And if that neuron is trained to recognize that excitation as the note A, then it's going to become excited and it's going to send out output signals. And you see there the blue ones over on the right-hand side at the bottom. But one of the problems with neurons is they're all connected to all the other neurons around them. So they tend to feed back on each other. So sometimes you have to inhibit the neuron and say, stop listening to that. If you're in a restaurant and you're listening to a conversation, one of the things that has to happen is the background noise has to be suppressed so you can hear the conversation. And that's when these inhibition signals come in and say, okay, stop listening to the background noise. Okay? But all of these like neurons are kind of interchangeable. They're all the same. The rules are mathematical. And guess what? We figured out what the math is. So we actually know the rules of neurons and how they work. So you've got a brain and it produces a mind now. And because a brain is emergent, just based on the rules of the networks of neurons, a mind must be an emergent thing too. And it must also have to do with the number of neurons, because we know that very, very small insects don't have minds per se. And we can argue about what the definition of a mind is. In this case, I'm going to say a conscious mind is probably tied to the number of neurons, and also the types of neurons that are available to that brain to more create a mind or not be able to create a mind. And also the architecture of the brain is very important. The human brain is broken up into segments, and each segment has a particular function, and they all work in parallel. And it's all this parallel operation that collectively produces, in the end, your ability to look at what you did and say, did I do the right thing? Should I do this again in the future? Wow, I'll never do that again. That was a bad idea, and so on. And that's all built on the architecture. So if we look at different kinds of animals, leeches with 10,000 neurons, they're not conscious. They're basically machines. They get input from the outside world through whatever senses they have, and they move towards something, they move away from something else, and if they get the right inputs, they latch on to whatever they're sensing and they start sucking blood from it. A lobster, more sophisticated, but still no conscious mind. They only have 100,000 neurons. They're not as smart as ants. A cockroach, though, has 1 million neurons. Is that enough to be conscious? We don't think so. Again, it's just a complicated machine. And if you watch the behavior of a cockroach, you can prove that it's a machine because it will always respond to stimuli in exactly the same way. And that's an indication that there is no conscious behavior. There is no ability to predict, for example. A mouse, on the other hand, is conscious. It's a mammal. And scientists have determined that all mammals have cerebrum. And because they have a cerebrum, they have the complexity to be conscious. So about 70 million neurons, that's the threshold. Now we're at consciousness. Crocodiles have more neurons than that, but their brain architecture is not sufficient to give them consciousness. They're not mammals. Now birds, because birds are prehistoric in nature, they've had a lot of time to evolve. And when a bird brain actually reaches around 100 million, neurons, they actually are conscious. So zebra finches, parakeets are conscious animals, and they get more and more complex. And when you get up around 300 million neurons, not only do you have consciousness, but you have self-awareness. And there are various tests you can perform to determine whether an animal is self-aware or not. The most famous one is the mirror test, where you paint a dot on the forehead of, say, a dog, and the dog looks in a mirror. Does the dog see that the animal in the mirror is another dog, or does it see that it's itself? And some dogs actually recognize, wow, that's me. Some dogs don't. So it's not every dog that's self-aware, but the smarter ones are. And then you get gray parrots, 4 billion neurons, definitely self-aware. They can actually have conversations that are meaningful. And it goes on, and you get into chimpanzees, gorillas, humans, and probably the most self-aware, one of the most self-aware creatures on the planet is the African elephant. And they communicate with each other, they cooperate with each other, they mourn the death of their friends, and so on. Now, at the next level, what if you take a group of intelligent creatures? Do they have an emergent capability too? Does group intelligence emerge from individual intelligence? There was an experiment done by a fellow that went to a county fair, and this was some time ago, but at the county fair, they would have a contest you could enter where you guess the weight of an ox at the county fair. And you buy a ticket and you write down on half of the ticket and your name what you think the ox weighs, and you put it in a jar and you keep your half of the ticket. And then at the end of the fair, whoever guessed closest to the actual weight of the ox wins half of the money that was put in. So if everybody bet 5 pence and there were 1,000 people, you make a lot of money. There probably wouldn't be that many. There'd probably only be 100 or so. But there was a fellow who went there, Sir Francis Galton. He went to this fair and he said, well, this is interesting. I wonder, being a mathematician as he was and being a scientist of sorts, he decided to collect all of the tickets at the end of the fair and do a mathematical analysis of the guesses. And what he found was the crowd at a county fair accurately guessed the weight of an ox when the individual guesses were averaged. They were very accurate. Out of 800 people making guesses at the county fair, they guessed that the ox weighed 1,197 pounds, and the actual weight of the ox was 1,198 pounds. They were only off by 1 pound. And if you look at the curve based on random guesses, the average error or the average accuracy on a group of 10 guesses was somewhere between, or the error rate was somewhere in the range of 1% to 2%. But as you went up, the number of combined estimates got closer and closer, and the error rate went down and down closer to zero until when you get to 800, you actually hit the line. So individuals can be very divergent in their answers, but the massive individuals can be very, very accurate. So that's interesting. Turns out that thinking and information processing, such as market judgment, can be much faster, more reliable, and less subject to political forces than the deliberation of experts or expert committees. An experiment was done in the stock market, and if you've ever seen pictures of the stock market, commodity will come up for trade, and everybody starts yelling and screaming out, you know, I bid 10, I bid 15, I bid 20 for orange juice, the price of orange juice. And the accuracy of their guesses on the future value of that commodity is very, very accurate. And at one point, some computer scientists tried to replace that process with computers doing the calculations and predicting the future value of the orange juice. And it turned out that the traders on the floor were more accurate and got to their conclusions quicker. And that's why they still do trading on the floor the way they do. This coordination of behavior can be seen in everyday life. And you see it like in the optimization of the utilization of, say, a popular bar. When the number of people inside the bar hits a certain number, people don't go in anymore. But if it's a lower number, they will go in. And it's, it's based on how sociable are they, and how much the drinks cost, and what's the ratio of men to women, and so on. We see it in driving. I've been on the turnpike in New Jersey, where it's absolutely frightening how we're all going 80 miles an hour and we're one car length apart, and yet nobody's running into anybody. And it's absolutely amazing, because every so often 3 or 4 or 10 motorcyclists will come through on cafe racers going 150 miles an hour, and they just weave through the whole thing. Nobody's having an accident. We see it with pedestrians optimizing pavement flow, crowding in restaurants, accurate judgments about the specific reactions of other members of a culture, and so on. So it is possible to describe how people in a group think as a whole, but you can't predict how an individual will behave. In some cases, groups are remarkably intelligent and are often smarter than the smartest person in that group. But 3 conditions for a group to be intelligent have to exist. And this is a little off topic, but I found it interesting. The 3 things are diversity. They can't all be the same. If everybody is the same race, ethnic, religion, scientific discipline, whatever, if there's no diversity, they tend to think alike, you're not going to see the mass group intelligence. They have to have a certain level of independence. You don't want to be in a group where everybody is doing groupthink or everybody looks to an individual leader, because they will tend to emulate the behavior of that leader or the opinion of that leader. That's a bad thing for group intelligence. And they also have to be decentralized, so that they can think as individuals. And the best decisions are a product of disagreements and contests. So debate helps in this kind of emergent behavior. And too much communication can make the group as a whole less intelligent, because that takes away the diversity, the independence, and the decentralization. And if you look at modern social applications that run on smartphones and the like, and the internet and Facebook and all of these social apps, that's too much communication. And that's why, if you spend too much time in these social apps, you actually kind of become stupid, because you lose the ability to think as an individual. So information aggregation functionality is needed. And the right information needs to be delivered to the right people in the right place at the right time and in the right way. But if you've got the right aggregation of people and you've got the right environment, you don't need an expert and you don't need somebody in charge. So now we get to the final thought. If nature is bottom up and emergent realities keep happening, no matter how complex things get, what does that say about the reality we live in? Is reality itself a bottom-up process? So I'm going to show you something. This is called Conway's Game of Life. And the game of life is, again, something that's based on nodes that have a kind of network and a kind of communication and a set of rules. It's called cellular automata, but I'm going to show you. And it's cellular in that each node is a cell, and it's automata in that the The rules dictate the behavior, and the behavior is automatic. Now, the state of generation n, whatever the state of generation n is at this moment in time, determines the state of the next generation, n plus 1. So here are the rules, but I'm going to take you through them individually. So there's a rule called birth. So we've got 8 cells here. And the rule called birth says that any dead cell, they're the blue ones, adjacent to exactly 3 live neighbors will become live in the next generation. So there is a cell here, the one with the star in it, that is next to 3 live neighbors, the 3 green cells. So in the next generation, bang, that one goes alive. Another one is death by isolation. If a live cell has one or fewer live neighbors in the next generation, it's going to die. So in this case, there is no cell here that has more than one neighbor. So in the next generation, they're all dead. Here's death by overcrowding. There aren't enough resources by overcrowding. So if you've got a live cell with 4 or more live neighbors, it's going to die in the next generation. So is there a cell here that has 4 or more live neighbors? Yep, and it's dead in the next generation. And then there's survival. Each live cell with either 2 or 3 live neighbors will remain alive for the next generation, and in this case, that's all of them. So those are the rules. And here's a video of these rules being played out. Now, all the dots that you see on this screen are cells, and the ones that are white are live cells, and the ones that are black are dead cells, and they are all following the rules. And here we go. Okay, that's enough of that. One of the things that you must have seen in there were patterns of these cells that, given a certain pattern, they would behave in a particular way. They would seem to travel. And that pattern is called a traveler. And sometimes these travelers, if they were of a particular pattern, would meet up with other cells, and those other cells would then disappear. And those travelers are called eaters. And you saw all kinds of complex behavior that was just based on interchangeable nodes following simple rules. Now, there was a scientist, Stephen Wolfram, who's one of the smartest people on the planet. He wrote a book called A New Science, and it's based kind of on this game of life. And what you see here on the screen is a pyramid, and we won't talk about the pyramid. We're going to talk about what's under the pyramid. And what you see is all of the rules for 3 cells. So if you got 3 cells that are black, in the next generation, the one that's in the middle is going to become black. If you've got 3 cells, black, black, white, in the next generation, the one in the middle will become white. If you got a black, white, black, the one in the middle becomes white, and so on. So those are the rules, okay? And if you think about it, because there are 3, we're working in a group of 3, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 possible rules, right? You've only got, and this is binary arithmetic, right? You're counting from 0 to 7, really. So 8 possible rules, and the actual rule itself is the square at the bottom. That's what defines the rule itself. So you're always going to have 8 possible rules, and the 8 possible rules are going to be all of the different combinations that you could do at the bottom. And the set of rules shown here create the picture you see at the top when it's run in a computer program. So depending on how you set up the initial conditions, you run the rules, you get this pattern based on these rules. Okay? But if you change one rule, the pattern changes dramatically. Look how different the pattern is. It goes from something predictable to something totally random, just by changing one rule. Now, parts of it are predictable. You can see that line on the upper left, that repeats on the right-hand pyramid. And going down the left slope, again, you see a pattern that looks like it's repeating. And then it starts to distort. It starts to change. It starts to go random. Well, what if you change one of those rules? And that's what he did here. He changed the very last rule. And look, you go back to a predictable pattern. Unbelievable. Now, what does this tell you? It tells you that you have something totally computational going on here based on nodes and rules and the passage of time. And depending on what rules you change and how you set them up, you're going to get different patterns. Now, what this book he wrote, A New Science, does is he gives you every possible rule for these 7 sets of 3 conditions. Every possible rule. And it's a very fat, heavy book. I bought this book, and when I tell you it's heavy, trust me, it's got to weigh 5 pounds. Now, one of the things that one of his admirers did was he went through all the rules, and he determined that if you set up a problem in the first row and you have the right set of rules, it acts as a computer and actually gives you an answer. And from this, Stephen Wolfram derived a rule of his own. It's called computational equivalence. And computational equivalence says no matter how sophisticated or unsophisticated your computer is, given enough time, it will produce the right answer. So a quantum computer will produce the same answer as an ant colony given the same starting position and enough time. They're going to do the same thing. They're all just computers, and they all have computational equivalence. Emergence is computational equivalence happening in time. Now, if we go down to the building blocks of the universe, our reality, this is the standard model that we know today. And in the upper left-hand corner, you got 6 items. They're called quarks. There's an up quark, a charm quark, a top quark, a down quark, a bottom quark. You got leptons. These are energy carriers of different kinds. You've got gluons. They're the orange ones. They're the ones that hold everything together. That's why they're called gluons. You've got scalar bosons. The yellow one is the Higgs boson. That's the one that gives us mass. And then they've got some hypothetical bosons that they haven't discovered yet, but they keep smashing atoms together and they're looking for them. So these are the modules. These are the nodes. And they must have rules, and they do. And that means that this is a computer of sorts that's going to result in an emergent set of answers. Now, Heisenberg famously came up with the principle of indeterminism. And it says if you change velocity and you change position and you multiply them by each other, you're going to come up with an answer that has to be greater than 1. Greater than 0. And what that means in English is at the quantum level, you can't know both velocity and position of a particle at the same time. You can know one, but you can't know the other, because if you did, your equation would come out to 0, and that's not going to work. And this relates, the h in this equation is Planck's constant. Now, Planck's constant is very important, but what it says, what it's based on, is the energy of a quantum, a photon. And it's a very, very small number, and it's based on the frequency of that photon and the radiation of that photon. Very small number. But h, Planck's constant, is the smallest size space can be. So if you go smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller in reality, eventually you get to a cell that is the size of Planck's constant. But you can't go past that point because reality ceases to work, because they become totally unable to follow the laws of physics as we know them. But at a large number of these things, when you aggregate all the effects of quantum mechanics, all of the non-determinism starts to aggregate, and eventually h over 2 pi starts to approach 0. And when it does, we get into Newtonian physics, because that's when things start to become predictable, because things average out. The indeterminacy of the individual particles gets averaged over in macroscopic, so they adequately deterministic laws emerge. Newtonian physics emerged from quantum physics based on this averaging out. So determinism itself is an emergent property. So the Planck length is the scale at which classical ideas about gravity and spacetime cease to be valid and quantum effects dominate, and this is the quantum of length, the smallest measurement of length with any meaning. And the smallest element of time is how long it takes a photon to cross the Planck length. So the number is 1.6 times 10 to the minus 35 meters. That's the smallest size element of reality, and that's the size of a string in string theory.
Because these are, expensive cars.
And what string theory is trying to predict is how the cells interact with each other. Because if they interact with each other, and there are rules about that interaction, that's what creates the emergent property of reality. At this scale, the universe is not analog, it's digital. It's based on cells containing strings that are vibrating one way or another, which produce, based on rules, reality. Digital physics is based on the premise that the universe emerged from the smallest units of reality and a finite set of rules about how they interact. Well, in the standard model, which is not based on string theory, right? But in the standard model, if you've got 2 up quarks and you've got 1 down quark and they combine, you get a proton. But if you have 1 up quark and 2 down quarks, you get a neutron. And the mass of 3 quarks two up and one down, one up and two down. The mass of three quarks is only 1% of the mass of the particle it produces. So that means 99% of that mass is coming from someplace else other than the quarks. Quarks are bound together by the strong nuclear force, and the strong nuclear force is one of those gluons, one of those orange guys over on the right. So that's in there too. And that's what's holding things together. And the strong nuclear force, holding them on, they pop in and out of existence. Gluons pop in and out of existence. A quark-antiquark pair can pop up out of nowhere, doesn't exist. Suddenly, you got a quark-antiquark pair. They momentarily transform a proton into a different, more exotic particle. And the true proton mass is the sum of all these possibilities of what it could be going on at once. Tongkang Li from Purdue University said, people say there is nothing in vacuum, but in physics we know it's not really empty. There are a lot of virtual particles which may stay for a short time and then disappear. Quark-antiquark pairs can pop into existence, and when they do, they're entangled. They're entangled pairs. So one of them can go off in one direction, the other can go off in another direction. And they're entangled, so the behavior of one, the existence of one, can affect the behavior and existence of the other. And if they meet up, they destroy each other, they cease to exist. And so they pop into existence, and they can pop out of existence at the same time. Now, a muon is one type of a fundamental particle. So it's an elemental particle in our standard model of physics, right? Now, if it's a fundamental particle, if it's a muon, it's a muon, and it's always a muon, and it'll never be anything but a muon, right? Well, it turns out that's not exactly true, because a muon, based on something affecting it, can transform into an electron, or an electron neutrino, or a muon neutrino. Well, how can that be if it's a fundamental particle? Something's happening somewhere. Each of these three products of the transformation is also considered a fundamental particle. So, kind of makes no sense. So now you have to ask the question, is there a set of rules at this level of existence that dictates that quarks must pop into existence as quark-antiquark pairs? Well, there must be, because they do it. And is it based on the cellular automata that might exist at the level of the Planck length and something we call strings now? Would this set of rules dictate that the existence of the universe itself is inevitable? That's probably true too, because here we are. So that's what emergence is all about. It's the movement of low-level rules to higher-level sophistication. And there are properties, there's laws at the upper hierarchical levels of nature that are not derivable from nor reducible to the properties and laws of the lower levels. And simple things lead to more complex things that lead to more complex things, and it goes on and on and on. And that's my story.
Awesome. Okay, let's keep the screen. Let me screenshot it for the cover of the video. Awesome. This I actually recognize a lot of the information that I've seen the first time you read this lecture, actually. So I'm really glad to see a lot of it, and it's just so exciting to put these little pieces together from, you know, the world of ants and bees and their colonies to different, you know, structures like the brain and all other, you know, interesting examples that you mentioned. This is just so awesome. And the theory of emergence, is it hypothesis or theory already? Hypothesis, right?
It's a hypothesis.
Yeah, it's a very wonderful hypothesis that gives me this hope of the future that I have a feeling.
So far string theory hasn't produced any predictable results. So they're working on it. You know, some of the best people, the smartest people in the world are working on this, but But as yet, they haven't proven anything.
Yeah, the string theory. Yeah, it makes me feel very excited, like any other quantum, theory or standard model. Just as I always like to mention and highlight for people who are not into too much into this, popular science, and at least science level that is accessible to regular people, like myself. I like to always highlight that the highest form of human functioning is actually theoretical physics. And it means that everything we know is just, for me personally, it's like one of the highest manifestations of our intelligence and our development, that we know for fact so many things about our universe, like that there are rains out of diamonds on some like far away distant planets. They're gonna take like hundreds of years just to get there, let alone human manned space travels, even just probes and any device, like something like what was the, I think we only reached the objects that were sent from our planet only reached the edge of solar system, which is just our neighborhood. But no human being is going to be able soon to travel to such high distances. But we know our mind was able to reach these concepts of crazy scales and sizes. I loved the fact that I was reminded lately about the order of magnitude of different ideas, that our language equalizes something like 1 million and 1 billion. So 1 million seconds is 12 days, and 1 billion seconds is 32 years. So the order of magnitude is sometimes so equalized by our language. Million or billion, who cares? Like when you listen to...
It's also equalized by the brain's inability to conceive of something that large.
Exactly. This is one of my favorite, mind training and mind, how do I say, like, not a trick, but exercise for our imagination, and feeling like our primitive animal brain is not able to imagine these numbers and imagine what infinity is. And like, I think one of the moments where I had time to think about some stuff, like there's an interesting thing that is called, like, it has different names, but like I think in America it was called something like deprivation tank, and in Russia it's called flow. It's like in spas somewhere you can find
sensory deprivation.
Exactly. And there's like something like a camp, like 2 to 3 meters, what was it in inches, and I mean feet, don't remember the size, but it should be something around this, like a big box big enough to have water deep enough for you to contain a person, like with your hands not to touching the edges, and it has like warm salty water that is like in the Dead Sea, and it can keep you floating on the surface, and they give you everything to feel comfortable in that water, so it basically, so that way you can lose connection to your physical body and use your imagination, your mind to travel, and for 1 hour you're just separated from the rest of the world. So sometimes because of the feedback of the internal model that we have in our mind, there's a lot of feedback that is coming back from our occipital lobe and our visual cortex back to our eyesight. That's why some people might start having hallucinations, and some people in isolated prison cells, they sometimes have these hallucinations because of all that feedback. And it's just been one experience. I've had this experience once, and I thought, okay, there's nothing to do, I'm bored. What should I do to make my mind wonder and enjoy things? And I thought, okay, maybe I could imagine those pockets of space that are between the strings and like in the universe, because we know about the Big Bang. It's the official beginning of the universe, right? 14.5 billion years ago. What was before that? Is there a God beyond that? Is there other, faceted universes similar to ours? Is it a circle of big bangs and black holes, swallowing the whole universe, the death of the universe, and then beyond that, it's like a circle of life, basically, that dead becomes alive again, and the expansion becomes, subtraction? Is that what you say? Like, yeah, anyway, so it's a very interesting mind exercise to think about these, different opportunities and realities. Try to just take some time and imagine what it feels to be in infinity. I always think about this like journey, I guess. It could be an inferno or like something like punishment to be aware of yourself, but yet to be immortal, and at the same time to be trapped in some boring space, like flying in space, for example, for hundreds and thousands of years, but being aware at the same time. Isn't it? It's just a mind experiment that is just mind-boggling for me, and it's just imagine being a rock that just flies into space for thousands of years and doesn't have, but still being aware. That's just interesting for me.
You should write science fiction.
Right. Oh, thanks to, I think I have one good example by Hadian Eon. Do you remember him? He's writing a pentalogy of books.
Oh yeah.
We all know him. Hi Dave, if you're going to watch this recording. So anyway, he's a good example. I think that it's a little bit too complex even for me, like linguistically and with the scale of ideas that he uses. Maybe if we try to adapt them, maybe I'll try ever sometime. My language is not very good. When I speak and I'm inspired like people like you and I have a conversation, I enjoy just like exploring these ideas and thoughts and science fiction. But there's so many good things that are written already. I think just spreading the ideas and combining different ideas is good enough, because we are at the point of humanity. I think that we reached a certain singularity point. Soon we're around it. Not only the singularity of AI, which could trigger maybe like this process, maybe take over the humanity, because we're too relaxed. We have relaxed standards, to be honest with you. We don't reach our potential.
It's like everything else, though. The singularity in the sense of computer intelligence. That's one singularity, and one of the mistakes science fiction writers make over and over again is they'll show you the future of space travel, and Star Trek is a perfect example. Here they are traveling through space, and it's 200 years in the future. Where are all the robots? Where's all the artificial intelligence that's going to be pervasive at that time? Where's the medical science that's going to give people the ability to engineer eyes that can see things that we can't see, ears that can hear things we can't hear, animals that could do things for us that
trees
can't
that glow
exist in the natural world, right? And all of that stuff is going to happen. But when you read the science fiction story, they just focus on one little thing. But the singularity that we're experiencing right now is multidimensional. We're seeing CRISPR happening right now, where
it's
genetic
editing, even considering the fact it's like ethically restricted, and it's not, designer babies are only at the very beginning of this, Overton window. They're born already, but it's not
right there.
Yeah, we are in the process. I keep telling people that when they say, "Oh, I think in the future we'll have this," I'm like, "Come on, guys, we live in the future. We have it already. You have to understand that it's not somewhere there. We're already there."
And consider too, if we break the code of epigenetics, when we understand the code of epigenetics, that's the cure for every epigenetic disease. And epigenetic diseases are the ones that have late onset. So type 2 diabetes, done. Diseases like eczema, cancer, all that stuff, it's going to be done. And we're that close.
There are so many other problems. Like if there is overpopulation, what about the new technologies that are going to be not extensive but intensive? Like, for example, food scarcity. Like, remember 100 years ago, they actually thought that we were going to starve because there was not enough food and they didn't have fertilizers. That was a simple reason why we were about to die. Do you remember the German guy, what was his name? The German guy who actually worked for the Nazis, and then he kept, experimenting with nitrogen, like trying to capture, was it nitrogen? Yes, I think azot. Nitrogen, I think. Yeah, because it was in the air, there's a lot of nitrogen, but you want it to be in soil to have, for this fertilization process and to have more crops and yields. And there was no technology before that to have
Right.
nitrogen in the soil. So he kept experimenting with that. So he had a very dark yet very interesting history, life, and he had a very sad destiny, but at the same time he was the person who was evil because he worked for the Nazis for some parts, but at the same time he was that person who actually saved a lot of lives just because he invented fertilizers, and 100 years ago things that looked very gloomy and we were heading into the ends of times. We're constantly living at the end of times, especially if you go back to the standpoint of religious beliefs. We're always dying, like for 2,000 years already, but never dying at the end. But so I think that it's just so important to realize that we live in an era where we can just combine the things we know already to come to some great ideas and like to great solutions for our problems. We already have the carbon, the extraction technology, these huge fans that I'm a huge fan. Huge fans that just capture the carbon from the air, because we keep thinking about this carbon emissions that we all have. I have this little anxiety about the plastic that I use and all the disposable things that I use. Like I drink for 5 minutes. I drink some Coca-Cola bottle or something and throw it away, and that is going to take 500 years to decompose for that glass if it's not recycled. It's gonna be more than 5 generations of my family. Like, how do I give birth to children and they give birth to their children, and then 2, 3 or more times more than that? If it's even like it's more than that. So if you count it as in 20 years, it's gonna take something around like 20 generations of my family. Crazy! 20 generations of my family are going to live the same amount of time that is gonna take this bottle to decompose. It's just crazy. And we produce these, this trash every single day. And I think there's a big problem. And we really, living in Russia just makes me silently depressed about these things, because people are so much not aware of this problem. They're not even aware of the problem of pollution and all of that. Again, there's a big question about it, because a lot of people, they are skeptical about science. They will say, oh, this video about, I just noticed the video about the slime mold. It's had the little signature that it was funded and sponsored by the Rothschild, something, last name was Rothschild, and they say, oh, these are evil Jewish people, they're like the secret, conspiracy theories and like a secret government of the, I'm like, they make more sense than you guys do. And like, maybe we should, become these proponents of these, crazy ideas that seem crazy right now, because we think about our individual survival. We're still stuck in individualistic thinking, and we are not part of the system. But I think we're about to become one collective organism. Why? Because there's finally this huge network of connection. So connection was one of the key elements of emergence in like system, I guess. And I think this is so important. We become more and more replaceable. Humans are more replaceable. There are different generations, different professions. We can use different technology for adaptation. If somebody dies, they can be replaced easily. I think that communication is what we lacked for, and also storage. We store a lot of information now, and I think that we can look back and cherry pick some of the technologies that are going to solve a lot of our problems. If we start killing each other, it's the biggest motivation for humankind, I think, because when somebody asked me, like, what do you think about wars? I said, well, as a person, I think that wars are bad because people are dying. Of course, if people are dying, it's always bad. But on the other hand, as a whole, as a humankind, we always, our history shows us that wars were the biggest, driving forces for technological advancement, for progress, for humanity. First, you bomb people and you nuke cities, and then you think, okay, maybe we can use it for peaceful nucleus, and maybe we don't want to kill people. We want to provide some energy for them. We want to provide some MRI, right? And we want to use these technologies for something that is not for destruction, but also for creation. But because the governments want to fund only the things that can, produce this mass weapons. This is our monkey brain with a whole bunch of dangerous things. And I think that we're getting close to the moment where there's gonna be like a big test. Like was it a great filter? Yeah, I actually did. We watched this video with one of my students lately, and it was just so interesting to go back to these ideas. Isaac Asimov wrote them like half a century ago. So I think even just going back to some ideas and using ChatGPT to make it more accessible to different people, and use maybe Midjourney to make it more. We don't want to you read. So reading a book might take weeks, and listening to audio version might take 12 hours, 20 hours, and just watching the video takes maybe from 5 minutes to 2 hours of a full video. It's much more how do I say, like it's easier to digest. So I think that it's a simple idea, but it could be one of those simple keys to propagate some ideas and raise the level of awareness for each person, because I think that's the key for our emergence as a humanity. We need to raise the number, increase the number of people in the world, in the population, that are going to have certain properties, which is going to be like self-sufficiency, like to be able to make some money and have some safety level, and get rid of those basic needs that should be covered, because it takes a lot of energy to survive on this stupid planet. It was like, why is it so? I love the phrase of my friend who said, when I was a child, she said, I struggled with staying alive in this world, because she said it was so burdening for me, she said, to think of the idea that just for me to survive and keep living, something has to suffer and die, like worms, you step on something, you have to eat these meats, like dead animals and all of that. She said it was just so burdening for me to think of this design of the world that we live in right now. So I don't know, should we overcome these limitations and somehow come to laboratory based meat and like different proteins that could be produced in an ethical way? Or should we just accept this hierarchies? It's very sad, but when we had this conversation over and over again with different people, almost nobody believes, very small number, like a fraction of people I talk to believe that we don't need, and we can survive and live and function in horizontal systems. They think that we need hierarchy, we need these levels, alpha, beta, omega. We want to know what is our place in the society, and it comes back to these hierarchies. Somebody has to be at the top of the pyramid. I believe that it's not like that. Look at the groups of people. If you gather 10 people with a low level of self-awareness, lower level of education, of background, that just makes them more primitive. Trust me, I know a lot of people like that personally, and I'm friends with them. They're good people. But in terms of functioning of a system, some people need orders, and they love having orders. It's just amazing how you think, wow. Do you want to have your own business and be independent, or do you want to work for a guy? Everybody says, no, of course I want to have my own business. But in fact, a lot of people work for somebody because they, in reality, responsibility is something that people don't want to have. They want to be told what to do, and it provides them with freedom for other places, like outside their job, where they can have some other quality of life. I guess I cannot understand that, because I don't want to spend 8 hours of my life not controlling what's going on in my life, and not having any perspectives into the future. So I naturally want to fall into, and I had that experience with these virtual reality events, where each person, when every element in the system, if you take statistically a group of 10 people, that are going to have a higher level of education, and naturally somehow it comes with the respect to other peoples and diversity, which is, it's very important to have different opinions, but still have the communication. That's really important, because I see in a lot of cases that we tend to have this atomization, like where people who have to interact from different parts of the spectrum in order to equalize, to get into this golden middle, they tend not to communicate. There are no spaces where they meet each other. They live in different, bubbles where they don't communicate. So
I really miss Old Space for that reason.
Yeah. I believe we can find a new place. There are many different platforms, and I'm trying to, explore that. And somehow I believe that I love to use this new linguistic trick that I used in different emails after Altspace was shut down or it was about to sunset. I kept telling people that we met once. That's enough. We are entangled. So we are entangled, and sooner or later we are going to meet again. Or we know and recognize this feeling now where you communicate to another human being, which is beyond that threshold that is going to lead to a, how do I say, like a number, the critical number that is going to be enough for the group to become like a collective organism. So when everybody is different but has this certain threshold of, I call it education, but it's something like more like development or spirituality. Who knows? I don't know. It's just a certain, you can feel it. When you talk to a person, you can feel it, that they can be respectful. At the same time, they can be very honest. They can tell you, I disagree with you. I think what you're saying is bullshit, even. But like they can give you arguments. You can have communication. So there's this, certain exchange that is going on, and it changes you over time. When you learn about any idea, I think there's this statistical data that we all have. Like, for example, when we have partnerships, like our husbands and wives, our brothers and sisters, our friends, we always feel this little, I don't know, I have it as an embedded system of, accounting, like assets and liabilities. And you always feel that. So the people, you always have this balance. Like sometimes you have more assets and, less liabilities, or the other way around. But when you have communication with a person, you can feel it, that you're equal and you have equal exchange, even though the energies might be different. Like, for example, like in some tournament species human pairs, where a husband is a provider, he provides like money and safety and all sorts of things, and a woman provides more stability and childcare. These are two different partners with different vibes. Sometimes they're like pair bonding families where they have two people who are even look the same, like similar. You've seen probably a lot of pairs that have even resemblance even in their faces, because they have like a little bit of a different principle. They're similar, more similar, but still we all feel this internal system that comes pretty much from ancient times, where we feel that whether there is a connection that is mutually win-win situation, or is it something that is draining because you don't get something in exchange, and it's always one-way direction and there's no feedback from the other side. So I think that once we get to the level where we can interact with people with this, past this threshold of communication and partnership, I'm not sure. I didn't have any business projects with people of such level of communication, but now it has changed me as a person, because I was trapped inside my city during the pandemic, and because I moved to this neighboring city, I didn't have connections. I was pretty much very depressed, because the picture of who you are changes when people constantly reject you because you're not their kind. They're not used to this level of communication of multi-level 3D, any ideas, because you're on the same page, because your pages are large and it's easier to find connections. Where people's, information field is much, more narrow, it's difficult to find like some points where you intersect. And with people who have wide ranges of different interests, it's easier to find different levels of intersection, and there are many of those intersections. So you can have a multi-leveled, communication where you jump from one topic to another, and it's fine. Like, it's really totally comfortable. It's like 3D printer, I guess. It seems like you're touching upon like different spots, and it's, for some people it's annoying and they don't understand how to communicate in such a way. Why do you jump from one topic to another? It's really difficult to follow your thoughts. But some people, they just know, because they have this map of 3D and they see the overall picture, so it's easier to communicate with them. So I teach language, so I keep thinking about communication all the time, and I think this is one of the new things that we have. We were able to communicate, but there were no, the number of connections was much slower. Travel was much slower, no internet, no connection, phones, not all people. And it happened so quickly, like so dramatically. I think that people don't even realize the order of magnitude of those changes that had happened, like, even before, the internet. And within the last 30 years, we are just in a great process that is so fast that it's really even difficult to fathom how fast it is. And locally it seems slow, but when you look at it from a different scale, when you think, wow, for 30 years, since 1990, we have MRI. We learned about our brain so much. We learned about neurology. We learned the population has grown from 6 billion to 8 billion. It's just so crazy. The numbers are growing and connections are growing like such a fast pace that it's just unfathomable. But I think these are all different factors that are going to make us get us closer to this singularity. If we don't kill ourselves, even if we kill, I think we are not going to die as a species, because we dominate this planet already, and even if like the majority of people die, I think that we are still going to survive, unless we follow the mice utopias scenario, and just there's going to be collapse because of the some populational tricks. Like China, they had one child, and then there's a problem that these children are not going to have children because they have 2 parents and 4 grandparents they have to take care of. So the world is aging. Like Japanese, I just saw a video about Japan that they have the aging population, and that's why a lot of the businesses they close down, because they used to have these family businesses where they would have it for generations and generations. There's the ancient onsen in Japan that was open in 7th century, something like that. Still functional, it's still working. And this is a family business. They were in business for 52 generations. It's just crazy. But at the same time, it's collapsing because people are not giving birth, and it's not. I don't know why. It's just so interesting to know why Japan is because we all want to learn from that, because the world is aging and we want to know what's going to happen to the countries that are at the very top of the aging process. And it's just interesting why it's going. Is it because Japan is so small and like they don't have enough space? But they have so many rural areas that are not populated. Urbanization is not reversible. It's just not going to go away soon. Why? I don't know. But I think that it's time to go back to some rural areas, because it's cheaper housing. Because I see a crisis of real estate right now, because since the 80s. Our salaries and income in different countries, even in Australia, the numbers were about Australia, but I see that different countries following the same pattern. Our salaries grew 5-fold since the 1980s, while the real estate prices, they're 15 times more. And that's why it's getting more and more difficult for me as a millennial. It's really difficult to get housing. Maybe because I'm too lazy now. not lazy, but we have different priorities. I feel like it's not only our life is not centered around house anymore and not around families. It's not because it's being distorted, and I think that family values are changing, the values in society. I don't know. I'm just very interested to talking to your son as a representative of a child-free community. Like, what are their arguments? Why do not they want to have children? Because I keep having these thoughts, which is really difficult to have, because we're still the minority, people who doubt the idea that you should have children when everything is going to hell. And I don't know, it's just interesting. So many different factors. Thanks for these lectures. I cannot stop from jumping from one topic to another, because everything is just interrelated. Just awesome. Yeah, let me stop the recording, and say hi to everybody from Humanism. This is a Discord channel.